Okay, we should get started. So welcome everyone. I'm Rob Atkinson. I lead ITIF, and we're really pleased to be able to co-host this event on smart cities today with our colleagues and friends from Boston University, who, as you will hear about, are doing some really leading-edge work in this space. Every time I give a talk on smart cities or smart transportation, I always mention Boston street bump. So if you don't know, maybe they can mention Boston street bump, and it's such a one of many very cool application, and as the name implies, invented in Boston. So we, as a think tank, ITIF, has been quite focused on smart cities, smart transportation for quite a long time. We worked closely with the White House on their Smart Cities initiative, and if you haven't read the third iteration of the White House strategic plan on science and technology, there's a very good discussion in there on the role of smart cities and what's going on there. So it's an important issue. Obviously, we're really just at the beginning cusp of it. As Stephen Ezell, my colleague, has written with regard to transportation, we invest at the federal level in smart transportation. We invest essentially on the order every year of what we could build 10 miles of road with. So that's how little we're investing. We're spending massive amounts of money on dumb cities, or if you will, dumb things that have no intelligence to them, and really very little on making them smart. Now that's luckily beginning to change both here and around the world. But we need to accelerate that change, and that's part of what the conversation today is going to talk about. We're really pleased that Elizabeth Grossman is going to moderate the panel this morning, this afternoon, and I'll introduce Elizabeth, and she'll introduce the rest of the panelists, and obviously my colleague and ITIF VP Daniel Castro will also come. So Elizabeth is Director of Civic Projects in the Technology and Civic Engagement Group at Microsoft, TCE. And TCE works with local and national communities all around the world in areas of smart and more resilient cities, open data, economic development and innovation, civic tech training, education opportunity, and efficient government services. Before joining TCE, Dr. Grossman was with the Microsoft Technology Policy Group, looking at the implications of emerging technologies for policy and society, again, all really around the world. So Elizabeth, we're really pleased you can join us and take it away.
Thank you.
And sorry, quick one thing. If you're in the back, there's lots of room up here for seats, so grab a seat.
Okay, well, first of all, I wanted to thank Rob for the very kind introduction and for starting to set the scene. I also want to thank ITIF and BU for organizing this panel and for hosting all of us here today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start us off with a few remarks on the landscape and the topic to sort of set the scene and prompt everybody to start thinking about the questions that you all might have. And then we'll go to the panels for some remarks, and then a broad discussion, and then Q&A. Just so that everybody knows what's coming. I don't have to sneak up on it. So I think what I want to do is talk a little bit at the meta level, and then get the very practical people to my left to sort of start talking about specifics. But I wanted to lay the groundwork by talking about the sort of factors that shape the smart cities movement today. One is, as everyone knows, the growing population in urban areas. Two are the increased demands being placed on city infrastructure. And I think of this especially in the U.S. Because the infrastructure was often designed and built over a century ago for cities that were very different in terms of the population, the types of activities that occurred in them, the needs of the communities, etc. And then, that's obviously another factor. And then the last one is there are new technical capabilities coming along every day. Cloud, connectivity, analytics, my personal favorite, machine learning, sensors, and IoT. Please don't tell anybody and then, of course, sensors and IoT. And of course, those technologies, they're nice and innovation is wonderful, but they have to fit in context. And that's really, I think, what today is going to be about. So I think it was mentioned, I worked at Microsoft in a group called Technology and Civic Engagement, and we were really formed to participate in the new and creative ways that cities and organizations and communities are doing and tackling the civic challenges facing cities today. And really, we participate, obviously, when tech can help, we like to help. But also to sort of learn about the new ways that society and tech are cooperating and coming together for our shared challenges. So I'm just going to sort of hit the three themes that we see. I'm lucky I get to work with our teams in cities across the U.S. and I have to admit I had a liberal arts education, so I treat it a little bit like a comparative lit course. How are they same? How are they different? What are the challenges? So, there's a lot. So I'm going to just hit the three things. As I said, this is just landscape for the actual practitioner experience. One that we find amazing is the breadth of motives for smart city projects. I mean, people are just like, oh, smart cities. But, when you get down to it, some of them are about improving the efficiency of government and infrastructure operations. It's very important. But some are more about research and insights into the societal challenges and how communities are doing and what does community well-being look like. And then others are actually about economic development and the startup ecosystem. And so these are very, very broad and different motivations that are shaping the project. Another attribute, which I'm sure everyone in the room knows about, is the complex interplay between information technology, physical infrastructure, and I'm not allowed to say people. Oh, human systems. People with all their messy emotions and views and values. And then the third one is the range of the groups involved. I think I have to say, having worked in a variety of areas, one of my favorite parts about being in the civic tech ecosystem is the number and diversity of the stakeholders. So government, foundations, companies, startups, universities, very wide range of different kinds of nonprofits, individuals, the coalitions of volunteers shape both the activities in civic tech and the culture and the nature of these activities. That said, look to my left, the role of government as champion leader is incredibly important. Yeah. All of these multi-actor, multi-purpose systems have the potential to have significant impact, but they are complicated to design, to execute, to validate, to maintain, to improve, to operate, all of these things. And depending on the phase, different organizations and different skills are required to lead, fund, and provide insight. So it's really, really hard. One of the great things about the U.S. is hard does not scare us. So we have a terrific panel today where I think we're going to really talk about the various approaches to effectively and responsibly realizing the potential of smart cities. And so, I have my list of topics. I hope all of you are making, your notes of the topics that we don't get to in the general discussion, so you can ask about them in the Q&A. But my list is implementation, policy, scaling, my favorite, inclusivity, public-private partnerships, and then a variety of individual areas like transportation, resilience, education, et cetera. Obviously, we're going to be here for the next 16 hours. I think, therefore, this is going to be the start of hopefully what is a continuing and ongoing conversation. Before I turn it over to everybody, I'm going to actually let them introduce themselves so they can not only say what they are, but what some of the work that they've been doing, so that you sort of get a feel for all the different expertise and perspectives. So everybody's going to talk for a couple of minutes each. Then I'm going to ask some questions so that we can have an intra-panel discussion, and then we'll finish up with audience Q&A. Three logistical points. One, we're just reminding everyone we are webcasting this. So when we do the Q&A, I'm told there'll be people magically appearing with microphones. And then state your name and your location. Two, I'm sure everybody knows there's a hashtag. It is up on the screen. It is hashtag ITIF Smart Cities, and the panelist hashtags are either in the handouts or on the screens. And then I've been told to remind people that there are seats up front. I see one, but if people need a seat up front, there's one. And then there are 3 seats. Excellent. So people should fill those. Those seats are long. I think that's it. And the last thing I will say today, thank you to all of you for being here, and then thank you for the panelists. I am super excited about the discussion. And we're going to actually go in the order that you see here, left to right, like the English language. So,
I would just, that was a great introduction. I'm very excited to be here and excited that it's such a great turnout for this panel. This is obviously a topic that excites me very much. My name is Lauren Lockwood. I'm the Chief Digital Officer for the City of Boston. The role was created at the very end of 2014 when I joined. My background is entirely private sector, and I only mention that because it'll shape some of the remarks I make later. But this is, so many of these challenges are things that we think about every day. So broadly what my team tackles at City Hall is anything related to digital communication, engagement, or service delivery. But what that actually sort of means for us is what we're trying to do more broadly is I have a sort of like North Star belief that we have the power with digital tools to change the way people think about government and the way that they interact with government. And so we started with a redesign of Boston.gov, which we launched this summer. And it's one of many attempts that we're trying to make to humanize government. And how do we take the kinds of in-person interactions that you might have with a neighbor or when you come into City Hall, and how do we bring those into the digital sphere? And so, that anything from applying for a birth certificate to how you think about getting moving around the city. And so, if you're familiar with Boston's Office of New Urban Mechanics, I know there's a lot of city techniques in the room. So we work closely with them, as well as BU and many of the other partners in Boston to think about some of these issues because they're much bigger than just City Hall.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be here. This is very exciting. So my name is Azer Istakos. I am the director of the Heritage Institute at Boston University, and I thought what I would do in the way of introduction, tell you a little bit about what that institute does, and maybe tell you about a few projects that we're doing, but also jump in and give you maybe what I hope to touch on there. So the Heritage Institute at BU is really a unique institute. You can think of it as an incubator. So you all know what an incubator is for companies and startups. Think about the university setting where you want to do projects, you want to seed them, and you hope that they will take off. So we incubate research projects. 3 of the projects I want to mention, 3 projects we have to do with cloud computing. So we have the Massachusetts Open Cloud, a wonderful example of public-private partnerships and engagement within the university setting. The second project is a modular approach to cloud security. It's cybersecurity platform. Privacy, how we keep clouds secure, and last but not least is the SCOPE project, which is a smart cities project, or local velocity project of MSF funding. So just to pick the discussion, I always like to say, so what is a smart city? And everybody can give a definition. And my definition of a smart city is a programmable, open platform city. So it has to be programmable. There is a word we use in computer science, software defined. So you think about the city as something you can program. That is a smart city because cities are not smart, it's people are smart, and people can put their smarts into programs. So the city, as a result, can be adaptable, customizable, personable, nimble, I mean, all the nice terms you want to have, but that's because it's programmable. And how do we go about doing that? So at BU, one of the projects we are incubating at the Institute is this idea of the Boston University campus, which for those of you who don't know, is right in the middle of the city. We have a subway going through it. We have actually 2 campuses in the city of Boston. One is the medical campus, one is the Charles River campus. And we like to think about BU as a microcosm of the city. So maybe we can start with some of the ideas for smart cities on campus. So this idea of the BU as a living lab. with the possibilities there, which are fantastic. I mentioned a few of them. Think about sustainability, situational awareness, student engagement. Think about gamification, behavior and social sciences, technology innovation, issues of privacy, which are very important. All of these can be actually studied, and so we can try out when it's there. Think about experimenting with smart X. And one of my favorite examples is the lights on Common Ave. They're fixed schedule, but they're not aware that students cross the street between classes. Wouldn't it be wonderful to go to do machine learning on all the data we have about where students study and where the patterns of movement, and then maybe when the classes are out, they start flashing red or do something interesting. Think about snow plowing. Wouldn't it be nice to know, where should I start plowing, given the traffic for students? Depends on when the snowstorm comes in. There's a lot of stuff that can actually be done along this. And last but not least, the experiential education and training of students. One of the biggest things about education, data science, cybersecurity, students need something that's really their religion. And there is nothing that they do more than a city, what they live. So I find that the smart cities, the introduction of smart cities, gives us a huge opportunity to really rethink how we can do education, STEM education, K-12 education, and these are all things that we're interested in.
First, as Rob said, it's really great to have so many great folks from Boston here. When we first started talking about doing this event, I said, well, yeah, it's Boston, we definitely do it. It's kind of a no-brainer there. So we're really glad you guys are here and part of the conversation. ITIF and its affiliated center, the Center for Innovation, we're doing a lot of work where we're looking at things like the government, Internet of Things, investments in digital hybrid infrastructure, basically how these can be used to accelerate productivity and social and economic benefits. I want to start by making, I guess, two broad points here. The first is that the cities of tomorrow are going to depend on the actions of the cities today, right? And so this is something, of course, we always know. It always matters what policymakers are doing now. But it's particularly true right now with smart cities and kind of the rise of smart cities that we're seeing an inflection point where there's really two paths forward for cities. They can choose to go down this route of investing heavily in digital, or they can choose not to. And just as we saw that the cities and towns that chose not to be on the railroad line or not bypassed by the interstate highway didn't really thrive after a certain point. That's kind of the same dynamic I think we're going to see play out in the future of the cities here with digital infrastructure. The second, and we do a lot of work with the Internet of Things, is that the public sector needs the Internet of Things. It needs it to be successful. So the Internet of Things also needs the public sector. And these are two very interrelated ideas. So first, there's a lot that the Internet of Things can do to really improve how government works, both in terms of how it can be more efficient, how it can be more effective, how we can reinvent, how we deliver services. But we've also done a lot of work looking at the Internet of Things and particular market failures associated with this technology that really require government intervention. And so, for example, and we're going to go through this in a big report, we talked about the need for national strategies around the Internet of Things. One example of this type of market failure is the chicken and egg dynamics that you see play out with certain emerging technologies. So, for example, you go to mobile payments, nobody really wanted to have a mobile payment on their phone until there's a place to use it. And of course, the retailers want to have mobile payment point of sale systems until there are people there had it, right? And so this is the type of example where the public sector moving forward as an early adopter can really change dynamics as well for industry and really help kind of bring along the rest of the economy. So I think we need to keep kind of both of these ideas in mind as we go through this conversation. Both, what are we thinking about in terms of changing the overall dynamics of different cities, and what are we thinking about in terms of making both government more efficient and using government as a driver of innovation?
Wow. I'm so tempted to totally change my list of I kind of do. Anyway, so actually one of the things that I'm going to pick up on something that Lauren referred to just to start us off, which is one of the challenges for smart cities is that the public space, whether that's the roads or the digital infrastructure or water systems, et cetera, they're fundamentally shared spaces. You can't say this is a narrow application for a specific purpose or a specific type of user. And I think one of the key questions is what approaches cities and other groups can take to design inclusively for different types of people, for different types of organizations. And I have to admit, I'd love to have Lauren start by talking about the recent redesign, because the approach that they took was really a model as we look around the various groups taking. So maybe start, and then we can obviously hear from everybody else.
Sure.
This question of inclusivity.
So what she's referring to is the redesign of Boston, which I briefly mentioned, but I think, I mentioned earlier my private sector background. I think one of the most interesting things moving to the public sector is that you don't get to choose who your customers are. Everybody is your customer, and so it's extremely important that whenever you're building anything, you're designing with inclusivity in mind. It became very clear to us early on that accessibility is not something you can think of at the end, or it's not something you can tack on at the end. It's something that has to be part of your design process through the whole process. And I think when people hear the word accessibility, they think of people with disabilities. We think about accessibility much more broadly, and so we think about people who speak English as a second language. We think about people with vision impairments. We think about people who can't read above an 8th grade reading level, which is the national average. And so it's important, no matter what kinds of tools we're creating, that we're building in such a way that the kinds of things that we're creating are not just for a techie crowd, but they are for everyone. And so that's everything from making sure that your loading your homepage doesn't gobble up someone's data plan, because increasingly we're saying that low-income residents disproportionately use mobile as their primary access to the internet. And if we're using up all their data to just download a photo on our homepage, that's clearly not a good use of their resources. And so we've thought about it very broadly through the website redesign and in all the tools that we're doing. And just to touch on scalability, we have made it sort of our default going forward. So we've made sure that in all of our procurements that go out related to digital tools, that things like ADA compliance are part of all of those contracts. And so we can, without, sort of in a lightweight way, scale the kinds of findings that we've come across to all of those things. The work that we do on the website, I think, is just sort of a microcosm for the way that we're thinking about this throughout the city. I'll turn to these guys to talk a little bit more about what they're seeing, but I think the thing that we're seeing is the smart cities or new kinds of newfangled digital tools should not require constituents to be techie themselves. There are a lot of ways that we can make improvements in cities and in experiences without requiring anybody to even change their behavior. We can put sensors on our roadways. We can become smarter ourselves without requiring behavior changes in others.
Great. I want you to pick up on that last bit. That's a really important point, because we remember what happened with the digital divide. When you introduce a technology, you risk actually making the divide even deeper. And so when we talk about technologies for smart cities, what should we think about to lessen that or even mitigate it altogether? I think one of the things that I see very important for cities and for government is to insist on open design and insist on open source and insist on putting together solutions that come from industry. Don't necessarily work together, because in a way they want the customer to be locked in, because that's the traditional way to think. In a smart city, the whole point is to connect these things together. You cannot just have the traffic control separate from the parking systems. They have to play together. So I think that's very important, and also important because then you can enable services. There are services that maybe nobody will sell, but maybe students will develop, or maybe innovators will develop. With an open design, we can help them to do that. Another thing I want to mention is when we think about smart city, we think about data and maybe data. I would argue that this is very important, but even more important is to provide the tools and the services that allow these data to be used. Services that don't require somebody to be techie to know how to, develop solutions. So I think that's an important point. So,
yeah, I was going to say, I looked at the Boston website this morning and ran it for me. It really is kind of, doing that level of what we want government agencies to be. It's interesting that you go and you look at it and you immediately recognize not that not just that it's kind of working for you, but how bad other sites are in comparison, right? It's like, it's so different than, the other sites I'm used to. And it's because we've gotten kind of used to this idea that, to interact with government, you have to, basically put yourself in the government's mindset, right? Like all the old government websites, it was structured around the different agencies that existed, right? So you had to figure out which agencies might service in and then go find that. And maybe they had a good site there, but you had to do the navigating. There's two, I think, really big trends in the kind of computer engineering world I think are useful that I think cities have started to pick up on. One is that there's a lot of merit to participatory design. So it's not just developers sit down together and figure out what we want to build, but they actually go out in the community and they're working with people and having feedback all along the way about what they want to do. And I don't know that you've done this, but I'm guessing you did it based on the result. The second is universal design, especially when you're talking about accessibility. There's a lot of interest in saying, how can we do universal design? So, the kind of classic example of this is, instead of stairs that some people can't navigate, you have a ramp. Or you have cutouts in the curb so that anyone can go up and down based on mobility needs. You can do the same thing in the tech space. And so I think as much as you kind of design towards the people at the margins, you help everyone. And that's something that we also really enjoy. And the last part in here, I really like this idea of, looking at cities as a platform for innovation. And I think that comes about especially through open APIs, which allow you to have other people plug in and find solutions that meet their need. And one thing that I think is especially important here is I'm thinking about the future and where we're going. I mean, we just did a really good conference last week on artificial intelligence. And one of the most interesting trends here that I think hasn't yet made the leap to government, but we will see soon, is this idea of, can we have more intelligent agents, doing things on our behalf? So basically, right now I can use an autonomous agent to, a virtual assistant to book a meeting for me. But can I do the same thing in the future to pay a parking ticket or get my driver's license to the DMV? Siri, pay my parking ticket. That's kind of where you want to get to. And it's not that the city necessarily has to design all of those services, but to have the APIs available, then you can have people plug into it.
Well, it's very reassuring given that our major event this in September talked a lot about intelligent systems and bots, that you can do something. So shoot, we're on track. Actually, the one other thing I also wanted to talk about is that Boston is, as we keep saying, a very sophisticated city on this. And one of the opportunities is taking the lessons from Boston's experience and putting them out. And so one thing I wanted to flag is globally, there's a global initiative for inclusive information and communication technologies, G3ICT. But anyway, they have an initiative around pulling together the principles, the model policies, and the relevant standards and metrics to the point of interoperability around ensuring that accessible technology is integrated into smart cities efforts. I think a key issue here is when you integrate it into the design phase, it makes a significant difference. When you tack it on at the end, it never works as well. And so to get that at the start and in the processes is really important. I think, so many questions about the right order. I'm just gonna try to do everything. Another thing that we sort of talked about was how do you go through the design process? How do you test things? So the reference, that BU is in the city. It's not off to the side, but it's a potential test bed. And I think this is a conversation we hear in all of our cities. What are the right test beds? You don't start by rolling something out across Boston. You design, you tweak, you validate. And so I'd love to sort of see what people's experiences are with using neighborhoods and cities and campuses, et cetera, as a living lab.
Sure, I'll start. Actually, to build a little bit on what Daniel said, we did design Boston Backup iteratively. We launched a pilot in January. It was just a proof of concept at that point. It was just 4 pages. Clearly not a replacement of the city's website. But the important thing I think is to, in any of these situations, just be aware of what you don't know. So my team, I'm very aware, looks a lot like people like me. People of a certain demographic, they know how to use an iPhone, they're into technology, they're young. And so we knew that there were a lot of groups we weren't hitting. And if we just tweet out from the City of Boston handle, anybody who wants to help us, give us user feedback, come to City Hall at this time, you're only going to get a certain kind of people. And so there's a huge challenge, which is just getting out of the building and making sure that you're going to where people are to make sure that you're incorporating their opinions. Because, I mean, I had a son recently, and going around the city in a stroller, you realize how many stairs there are. And you start realizing, you start seeing things from the perspective of somebody who, doesn't have the same abilities or doesn't have the same, just has a different reality for the way that they interact with cities. And so it's so core and important to think about as we design anything. And so for all the things that we do, starting with a pilot or starting with some sort of small version of a project really helps us de-risk a project. So for a lot of people, this word agile sounds really scary and risky. It's in fact for us much the opposite. So rather than trying to roll something out citywide, we as a standard practice, roll it out in a specific area or we find a way to chunk it up in a really small way to start testing ideas. And so we did that recently with our Park Boston app, which allows you to pay for parking meters on your phone. We tested it in back papers, right by VU. And so we build a little bit, learn from people, and then expand. And I think that has been a model that has served us well, not just, you can imagine doing it in sort of any context, not just digital.
I think I'll pick up on this, and Daniel said something about we can learn something from how engineering is done. Software engineering used to be this sort of top-down idea. You get a big product, you go through it, and you deploy it. You get a big disk from Microsoft with the system that you install. Today, it's exactly the opposite. A sophomore, high schooler, can develop a very creative app, put it in the App Store, and deploy it. And then what happens? Well, they get feedback. You see the app always evolving. And in a way, sometimes the apps start doing something else just because they really people use it. I think this is an example of agile approach. And I think for smart cities, we actually need the other end. I always like to think of Boston as a legacy system. So how do we go from legacy city to smart city? You have to think about the past. Well, the new campus is legacy campus. Right in the middle of the city. What can we do on a smaller scale? What can we showcase? What technology can we put out? What solution could be very exciting and interesting? I'll be happy to talk for hours about examples of things we're doing, but you get the idea. So I think this is very important, prototyping at different scales. So one scale could be prototyping, just a small neighborhood. Another one could be even in the lab, like simulations. And you can start with that. The other thing I want to add here is the importance of interdisciplinarity and involving different teams. We technologists, and I'm one, tend to think that we can design anything, we can solve anything. The truth of the matter is, you really have to involve a much broader team. Social scientists are very important. Behavioral scientists are very important. Involve them early, because the impact of the design could really be unexpected. There was mention earlier about the street bump projects. What is that street bump project? Well, imagine an app on your phone, and every time your phone has a gyroscope, every time your car bumps on the street, it knows, well, there's a pothole. And if I see everybody with a cell phone driving through that area, getting a bump, that must be a pothole, we'll fix it. So we designed it in the city of Boston and we used it. But think about, and you think this is fantastic app, right, technology. But think about who uses phones. Are we gonna get some streets fixed first simply because there's a lot of people with phones who are highly educated who drive on these streets versus people who may have phones but they don't download the app? So who is likely to download that app to help the city? Well, that has an implication on reporting the potholes. Now I'm going to fix some potholes before others. Is that fair? Going back to inclusivity so I'll just leave it here.
Yeah. Great points. I think I just add on here that one of the biggest lessons I think cities are getting out of this is that they're doing the prototyping and they're promoting a new way of developing. But the point is that's not just how you develop a product and then you're done. This is the new model of operation. So it's that testing, that living lab it's always at different scales. I mean, you start with a pilot and you grow it out to the city, and hopefully, then eventually you're scaling it nationally. Even if you're talking about just at the city level, once it's implemented, the difference between the future smart city and where we've been is that you don't say, well, this is our program we have in place, we're done. You say, no, now we have a system where we can measure and see things in real time, and we can be adapting, continuously improving, and we can see where there's problems and reassess and evaluate. And that's the big difference. And so it's bringing that new design mentality, I think, to solving problems, but it's also applying that to the management of government in general.
I think that's a really incredibly important point, and I think one of the things that we see in our cities is that as cities build this muscle, they're in a much better position to recognize the opportunity. So, for example, in Chicago, they are starting on a massive series of investments in their water infrastructure. Urban flooding is an issue there, as in many cities. And they're about to do a great deal of work on green infrastructure, so permeable pavers, natural plantings, et cetera, to help reduce the burden of the underlying infrastructure. And they can see that as obviously here's a big new physical investment, but at the beginning of it, they're also thinking about how do we put sensors and analyses in place for us to understand how that green infrastructure is performing, so that we don't just come up with a 10-year plan and investment, but we get the information right at the beginning to change and evolve our plan. And so that's exactly that idea of building a new muscle in all sorts of areas for smart cities. So I wanted to flag that. The other thing, to the point of getting out of the office, there's some very interesting examples in Chicago and now in Detroit of cut groups, which are civic user testing groups, exactly what you guys did. But it's, in some sense, creating a people infrastructure. We talk about connectivity being an infrastructure for the smart city, but there's also an infrastructure of how do you do outreach to different communities and get them to be able to provide input where they are and at their levels. So I think those were sort of two examples on the next slide. The next thing I wanted to do was pick up on the references earlier to the Internet of Things as sort of a key enabling technology for smart cities, and how there are both significant opportunities here, but there are sort of the questions that come around of what kinds of policies and what kind of investments that cities need to be thinking about to effectively and practically deploy Internet of Things enabled technologies and systems. Maybe we'll start actually, Dana, with you since you had raised it, but sort of what are the sort of opportunities and steps that need to be taken?
Yeah, so with Internet of Things, I think there's a lot here. One of the biggest opportunities is the opportunity to collect new types of data to solve existing problems. And why this is, I think, really interesting is because a lot of this data that will be collected from smart devices, connected devices, whatever you want to call it, they're not going to be city-owned infrastructure. So, for example, in California, with one of the recent earthquakes, after the earthquake, Java did some analysis. Java does like Fitbit, other wearables for activity tracking. They looked to see, what kind of signals they got from the data of users in that region, and so they were able to accurately estimate the ground shakes at different distances from the epicenter of the earthquake, and that's something that actually is hard to do because it's not just what's the magnitude of the earthquake. That's something you always measure. You actually want to know what happened on the ground, these different locations, and that can feed into city response. It can feed into city planning, and all of this is privately owned data that typically it was actually the federal government doing it and feeding it back in. But suddenly you had this new private sector provider that could be this really valuable source of information. And what we're seeing is there's kind of countless examples of that where there's just new sources of data that might be useful. Some of it might not be, some of it may be. And so the question is, how are we going to make sure that we are extracting those insights and allowing government to use it when necessary, allowing government in partnership with the private sector to use it when necessary. And oftentimes, of course, I think Jawbone's interesting. They're a startup. I think they're based in California, so they kind of had this question, I think, internally. Can we look at this? but you're not always going to see that. And so I think one of the big questions is how do we basically turn this infrastructure that we're building, sometimes unintentionally, into something the government can use. Because it's not that the private sector is going to always solve public sector problems, it's that there's that opportunity to do it. So have we created some kind of mechanism where we can form partnerships, where basically government can pose certain problems and potential collaborators on solutions can come together, and then maybe we can even have really innovative contracting methods, and then set up some type of solution to try and solve those problems.
I might just jump in. I think that this is such a terrific point and such an important one. The city of Boston recently partnered with Waze for their data because we were, it's such a sort of weighty problem when you start thinking about how do we become a smart city. And you think about, the people in your transportation department are like, oh my God, we spent so much money on roads already. How do we rip this up and think about what the new world looks like? But in reality, there are a lot of networks that already exist that we should be tapping into. And so we looked around and it was like, there are 400,000 people in Boston that use Waze regularly. And it's just sitting on your phone and we have a lot of information there. And so we partnered with them on a, not really knowing necessarily where we were going to head with the data, but have done a lot of interesting projects based off of it. So we know how long it takes a person to get from A to B. And so we've been able to do things like, all right, if we give this bus line green light priority, what happens to the cross traffic? And we can measure the impacts of different kinds of effects, and we can make the city smarter without ripping up roads and putting in expensive sensors or anything like that. We can just do that quite quickly. And so those kinds of public-private partnerships have been extremely important for us because, as you said, the future likely doesn't include the city or states necessarily owning all the infrastructure, but rather tapping into those kinds of networks that already exist.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that there are a couple of things I could add here. The data that is available could be used for things you never imagined it could be used for. So we typically think about Waze data. Well, we have a project, Lucy Otira, in environment sciences at BU, who used traffic data to estimate CO2 emissions in the city of Boston, almost block by block. Not 10 kilometers square, but block by block. Why? Because I can use data about cars and trucks that move to the city, have knowledge of the emissions, and I can build that. So one thing we learn about big data, etc., is data may come from source A, but its use could be totally different. And especially when you combine data from other places. So I actually do think that a lot of the data is not going to come from the city. I'll give another example. It's an underdog. It goes to Facebook and Twitter and gets geotagged tweets and then says, well, how active are the different communities? I want to see who's tweeting more. And so is it time of day? And to me, that's an impressive source of data. And so what's the city's role, public sector role here? I think actually as a broker of this information is very important. So the data may be owned and generated by other parties, other networks. But the city should act as a sort of a platform to make all of this available, or at least facilitates the connection between these. I'll stop.
I'm actually going to build on that a little bit because I think, we as a large company are having conversations with a bunch of different cities and organizations about that subject. And often the organizations are very interested in sharing the data, and then the question becomes under what circumstances, and sometimes that's a policy question, sometimes a technical question, can you combine the data from these different sources for these additional purposes? And I'll give a specific example, which I like because it touches a lot of different players. This is a project with the University of California at Davis, so it highlights the key role that universities can play. And it's looking in California, they are very sensitive to water issues. And one of the things they were looking at is the various factors that contribute to water usage in California. And specifically, they wanted to look at energy. So cleaning water, but particularly moving water around in California requires a significant amount of energy. And in order to sort of quantify that impact and then do modeling on what changes to policies might affect that usage, you needed to combine information from the city, information from water utilities, and information from energy utilities and make that accessible to researchers. Now, first of all of those data sets, some of them contain personally identifiable information, some of them are critical infrastructure, subject to critical infrastructure regulations, et cetera. And so what was done was to build a platform in which the data could be combined with technical implementations that constrained its use to certain types of people, to encrypting certain columns, et cetera, that allowed them to do the study that quantified the energy-water nexus. And so it's these sorts of collaborative activities where you couldn't have done it without the universities, without utilities, and without the governance roles that are going to have to be developed and tested and then extended.
Can I jump in? This is actually very important. This notion. This is privacy, and when we connect data, who actually will pay attention to the privacy of the citizen other than the citizen? So, to me, I think that this is very important. Oftentimes, you are presented with this false choice. It's either you're going to get all the goodies from the technology, but you have to give up on the privacy because Waze has to know everything about you, or just live in the dark ages. This is a false choice. We have examples after examples where you can do what we call multi-party computation. You can do privacy-preserving analytics. And the way to do it is not to give the data, but to put a platform on top of it and allow these APIs to be designed with an understanding of what are those data and what should I include. I mean, the point to be made here is I think sometimes society is given false choice. And I think universities and the public sector have a role here to say, no, this is how it should be done. It's not how you think it should be done, it's how it should be done, because that's how we ensure things like privacy, accessibility, and stuff. It is very important.
I can just jump on that real quick. Because I agree with that completely, and I also think that, I mean, there's probably some lawyers in the room. I mean, we can also use legal measures to protect privacy, and that's something that has to be part of these conversations where, especially the government sharing data, the private sector sharing data with someone else, they want to maintain the same guidelines, but they can do it, and this is how we've done in the past with government data, like the census, where there's different levels of sharing. So the census has some data on its website you can download. They also have some data that you can only access if you sign an agreement and you go into a locked room where there's no computers with network access. So there is a whole scale too, because sometimes the technical measures aren't enough. We need to make sure we can also use the hand-in-hand technical measures.
I might just add on to that a little bit. Even just like at a very granular level, though, I think that people get really excited about the promise of open data, and it gets used a lot. People think about the promise of things like predictive analytics and everything, but at a very base level, a lot of open data is not very accessible. So it's nominally available, but it's not. You look at some of the data sets on a city's website, it's a joke. You can't. Like, the column header is some gibberish acronym, and so I think there's also a really important role to play with cities and different organizations who are providing the data to truly make an effort to make it accessible for people, not just people working on predictive analytics, but everyday citizens too.
Just jumping on this, and you know about this, so at BU we are teaching a course called data mechanics. All of you know data analytics. So what is data mechanics? Well, to do the analytics, data has to come from autonomy. I really have to do a lot of work to get the data to the point where you can do the analytics on it, especially with these data. I mean, some of it is in PDF files, but we can have these platforms built. We teach a course on this, and the students do marvelous things when it comes to these data mechanics. I totally agree on that.
So I had a question on open data, but they took care of that. But I actually do. So I want to really emphasize and make sure if anybody else wants to add on this, which is that data itself is necessary but not sufficient. State that was the sort of opening for the question, which is what are the right tools for the right applications? So I mean things like the Landsat data that comes out of the U.S. federal government, the satellite images, there are a lot of different applications that can be used for, whether it's climate related, whether it's land use and prediction about flooding or population growth, et cetera. And making it available is not the same as providing the next level of analytics for different regional planning authorities, for cities of different levels and sizes, et cetera. I think that's just an incredibly important point. And I just will flag, there was a report actually that came out on Monday of this week, which has open data recommendations for the next administration. A good read, but one of the points that's made in there that's really, really important is, yes, it's a recommendation to the federal government, but we talked about public and private data. There's also data at multiple levels of government, and how do you make that available and enable it to be combined for the citizens and levels of the citizens can engage.
If I can just pick up on that point. I mean,
Yeah,
I think one just kind of key point there is that we also still don't have comprehensive federal open data legislation. And if you look at historically, I mean, the Obama administration when he came in first day in office and had the Open Government Directive. I mean, that even though it was a federal directive, it really did set the landscape for what cities and states did in the years since then. It really helped set national direction. And I think having Congress actually do comprehensive open data legislation, we do the same thing where it says this isn't just a one-time thing with administration, but it's really this is kind of, we have to embed this in government. It's something that's a core part of government. And what's interesting about the legislation that's out there, it's not just saying let's release the data sets we have. It's really saying we need to think about the whole data life cycle. So we need to think about data collection. We need to think of how it's stored. We need to think about the APIs. And, get into that mindset. And that's still a change for, I think, a lot of cities and states. They're moving in that direction, but, making that just kind of a core part of government function is, I still think, something we need national leadership on. And that's hopefully something we'll see, Congress take on.
And I think there's been some very great initiatives just recently and announced within the past month around data for resilience, and then obviously the Cancer Moonshot activities, which are very much about the full data life cycle of how it's collected, but could be what is the full ecosystem of users and how do we make it more easily available to them. But I think that's right, which is you learn from those experiences, but you want to also develop the broad muscle so that the next time around is a little bit easier to put those initiatives together.
Well, the police data initiative is a great example of how, it's a federal initiative that's all cities, right? And it's, so much of that is also on the data collection side, where it's not about just releasing, it's about even collecting information the right way in the first place.
And one of the best stories from the police data initiative is that the phased release of data. And one of the phases in New Orleans that they did before they put the data up is that they worked with a camp that was teaching programming to young people in the neighborhoods. And they were sort of the first group that got to play with the data and trying to figure out what it meant. And so that was both sort of a test of how accessible and usable the data was, but it was also a trust-building activity between the department and some communities that they didn't traditionally work with.
Just to start building this idea of trust, I think one really interesting thing that came up as we were redesigning the website, we had we went to people's homes and had conversations with them as part of the research phase. And to this point about open data, I think a lot of times people misinterpret government's incompetence as a lack of transparency or sort of this sinister plan to not be transparent. When in fact, I think Boston is looked to as a positive example of a city that really has its act together with data. We were early on in the open data movement, but we still have a lot of struggles with warehousing data, and any DBA would be sort of horrified if they looked at the staffing we have around our data and the kinds of structures we have. And so I think that cities have a really long way to go in terms of just improving their own internal capabilities. But I think the important thing is that this open data movement shines a light on the areas, the gaps, and it becomes really difficult for a department to say, oh, we don't collect that information, because it's not really an answer that flies anymore. And so I think that one of the really important things is really put a huge responsibility on government to both collect information in a responsible way and then store and organize it responsibly.
So I want to make sure we get to questions from the audience. So I think I'm going to do one last question, but it's a really big one. which is the question of scaling, right? And we talked a little bit about scaling within cities, of starting with a test bed and working out. But there's also how can cities share and build on work that's done in other locations, so that each city, while they might have their own priorities, doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. And then the related question to that is the role of the public sector and the private sector in scaling in smart cities, and how they work together. These are related questions.
I mean, just jump on this one. We're announcing in a matter of minutes that we're going to open source the entirety of the Boston website. It's going to be all released to the Creative Commons, so fully open sourced. We're hoping to engage the private sector community, developers everywhere, academic institutions to help us not just improve boston.gov, but also allowing other cities who are a part of this sort of website redesign epidemic that's sweeping the country, use features of our website or the entire thing so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel, really. And so actually BU, I think, submitted the first pull request. Thank you. That for me has been one of the really interesting things moving from private sector to public, is that there's not this competition. The competition between cities is sort of friendly and competitive in sort of like a healthy way, that sort of drives us to all get a little bit better. But that also means that there's a really interesting opportunity with open sourcing code by default, opening our data and learning from each other in a way that's not typically seen in the private sector. And I think it allows us this opportunity to really scale in an exponential way the kinds of interesting and successful things happening around the country.
So on the issue of scale, first of all, this is the answer that everybody should take home. Open source. I mean, if you think about what I talked about earlier, that's related to it. So thank you to City of Boston being a model there. And the first goal of this data of this website was this data mechanics course I talked about. The students are eager actually to jump into it. Let's talk about scale. And one dimension I want to mention here is the scale of, if you put out the data, it's not enough. You have to put all the tools that make this data useful, visual, etc., etc. And these tools are software. Software is very expensive to maintain. It's very easy to get an intern and say, they work for a summer that could do something wonderful that would help a government, somebody who works for the city to do a better job. But then what happens when it needs to be updated? That is a huge cost. And from our experience, this is the missing thing. So how do we keep up all the software developed? Access data make it useful. We find that universities have a big role to play there, but then we get into this question, who's going to fund, let's say, students or interns or software development? So I think this is a perfect example of a public-private partnership with industry participation. I'd love to see companies, industry, support internships to support city software development. I mean, that is very important, I think. That's an issue of scale. You need scale for software development. You need also scale for storage. There's a lot of information about all the data. Well, what do we keep it? How do we keep it? How do we make sure it's correctly saved? I'll give you another example perfect example of public-private partnership. Boston University, Harvard University, MIT, University of Massachusetts, as well as Northeastern, have collaborated to build something called the Massachusetts Green High Performance Computing Center in Hollywood with state support. That has really changed how we collaborate with universities. It changed how we start thinking about maybe we can take a lot of the data the city produces, put it there. Maybe we can develop these open cloud and open source environments. So I think the answer here is we have to find incentive compatible ways for all these three parties, the cities, the universities, as well as the private sector, to join and efforts and be able to tackle this question.
I guess maybe 4 points here. One, really glad you're here because I think one of the issues here is people, right? It's about training. You can scale the technology, but you can't scale people easily. That's the university system. I think that's part of it. The second is that I often ask why was Uber created in the private sector versus the public sector? In the public sector, they kind of ran the tax integrations or had oversight with them. Every city wanted to manage this problem. No city said, well, why don't we create this great app that we use. Some of them created apps. They didn't think, well, why don't we create one app that can be used everywhere? Because people would really like one app that's everywhere. I think that kind of scalability thinking, basically, do we have investment, that's kind of driven by the public sector in technology? Right? Do we have incubators that are focused on public sector? And do we have, cities and states as key partners in making these investments? I think kind of long-term on smart cities, we need to be thinking about whether there needs to be new investment models or whether cities can do something innovative in that space. The third thing here is, we talk about scale, we need to talk about being able to make comparisons across cities. So it's one thing to talk about performance internally, but what we really want to be able to do eventually is find fewer cities and be able to say, well, your water system's performing better than mine, and have kind of common metrics that we use to do these kind of cross comparisons. And I think one of the problems right now in the smart city development space is that while cities are sharing some solutions, they're not really sharing performance metrics in terms of developing some kind of standardized way of looking at what that is. And that's not an easy problem to solve. And I think that gets to this fourth point, which is I think it's great that we're kind of moving into the open source world. I think one of the biggest challenges for city agencies will be basically changing their orientation so it's outward looking, right? Because it's not just about their own city and what they're doing, even within their agency or even cross agencies on collaboration. But it's about, are we really thinking about, if we're collecting this data, we're publishing it, is there a civic standard out there that we can use? And maybe if there's one out there, they easily adopt it. But what if there's not one? Well, are we just going to do our own thing? Are we going to bring together 5 other cities that might be doing something similar and work with them on doing something? Or are we going to just put out our own? Because there's different ways of approaching it. There's really no incentive right now to do that, the hardest thing, which is get people in the room and do things that your constituents don't actually really care about in a direct way, right? And I think that's going to be one of the kind of biggest public management type challenges that we're going to have in cities. Is how do we kind of create this new responsibility that there's really no incentive to do, but it actually has a really big impact on our success? How do we kind of create that incentive structure so that works? And we're starting to see some of this in Europe. I think they're doing some really good things with smart cities. One of the interesting things they did tied to some of their funding on these what they call the lighthouse projects is when they funded smart city projects, the city had to come forward with a proposal, but it wasn't just what they could do for their own city. They also had to identify some of their peers that kind of agreed to support it and said, if this city is successful, we can learn from them and take on some of their ideas. So basically, you basically have endorsements of your colleagues. Building that kind of network is, I think, also really useful.
Terrific. So I actually want to add 2 points before we turn to the Q&A. One is specifically on performance metrics and gathering the information and the data to enable people to actually look at those metrics. And there's a project that was announced by the Lincoln Land Institute at the Habitat 3 conference in Quito recently. But basically, the Lincoln has been collecting data on municipal fiscal performance because they wanted to collect the least sexy database they could possibly have. But they've been collecting it for years and international. And what they were working on was building a set of visualization tools that would allow a city A to look at their information about how they're funding. Are they doing bonds for their infrastructure? Are they raising their tax base, et cetera? And then to put that in the context of other cities of similar size, other cities in your country, other cities, et cetera, so that you could look at your portfolio funding activities if you were a CFO, and then compare them to other cities so that you might have a different idea of what you're doing. And that kind of sort of tools for understanding the metrics and what are the cities like you that you might most learn from. So that was one. And then the second one is I was talking to a CIO who will remain nameless, and they made a very similar point to Lauren, which is that there are certain cities that are competing to be first in things. But then there is a whole other set of cities that is really very excited to be second because it de-risks it in a way that is more appropriate for their scale, their activities, and really their level of resources. And so thinking about serving both of those communities and how you design a partnership for the innovative cities, and we're seeing learning networks in Boston, New York, Chicago, et cetera, where the CDOs, et cetera, get together, but also how do you enable that next tier of cities that doesn't have the scale of resources to implement it. And that's one of the things that the private sector thinks a lot about. Like Uber thinks about, what do I have to invest to be functional in multiple cities? Microsoft thinks about, what do you have to invest in for different levels of customers and capabilities? And that's a way for public-private partnerships. And I'll just mention two, and then we'll go to questions. One is City Digital in Chicago, which is looking at experiments using Chicago as a test bed on smart and sustainable infrastructure. And another is Super Public, which just launched in San Francisco, but is from the beginning thinking about multiple cities right from the start. So I think those are sort of two different but very exciting models. Okay, Q&A. You've had plenty of time to think about this, and I don't, who has the, oh, there's the microphone. So why don't we start the first hand that went up was right there.
Thank you, Anne Robbins with the Computing Community Consortium. Sorry. Thank you all, this was wonderful to hear. My question is, you're talking about the need for openness, which I agree is totally important to make it all work. You mentioned privacy, but one thing that really didn't come up in this panel is security. And when we talk about bringing in different systems so that we don't necessarily have to break everything to rebuild from the beginning, how do we keep security in our mindset?
Excellent question. I mentioned one of the projects that we're doing, and we call the modular approach to cloud security, MAX. It's a $10 million investment from NSF. It looks at exactly that question, which is, if you have two systems that are independently secure and you put them together, the result is not necessarily secure. That's a very important point. Security does not impose automatically. And again, I go back to something I said earlier, the first choice. Maybe because we are afraid of security, we say, well, we can't put that together. Because I don't know what will happen. You know, toasters, when they connect to the internet, we get the DOS that they had last week, right? So the question here is, but that's a false choice. That's because toaster companies did not have the government telling them this is how you should design it so that it composes correctly. So I think the question here is, can it be done? The answer is yes. Is it more expensive? Yes, it will be. But we have building codes for how high this step in my house is, but we don't have building codes for the software that's going to be put together. So I think this is another example of where public policy, government should step in. There is a lot, I mean, as a computer scientist, it pains me when always I see, oh, it cannot be done. You cannot do analytics on data that by law cannot be released. You can do it. We have done it with the salary equity project in Boston. We had 50 companies with payroll data. And we did analytics over that without anybody would approve of it. The data will not leave the company. You can do this. It sounds like magic, but the point is, it can be done. It's more expensive, and that's the point. So I think this is a great question, and I think this is important. And some of the reasons sometimes companies don't want to put their solutions together is precisely because of that.
I think what I would add is that a lot of times people aren't thinking what is the alternative option. So yesterday I was in a meeting with people and they were talking about bringing a bunch of processes online, and they were thinking, well, what about the security risks? And I was like, how secure is paper? So I think in some ways there is this false belief that bringing things into a digital sphere is somehow less secure than the way we have it now. But the other thing I would say too is that in some ways, opening things can actually make it more secure because you have more scrutiny, you have more eyes, you train specialists reviewing your code, reviewing things, and being able to highlight different vulnerabilities to you that you might not have otherwise seen. And so I would just kind of throw that out there. I don't know that that's also, of course I mentioned that we're going to open source society. We're probably going to get attacked or something now that I've said this, but the truth is that as long as you have rules around the kinds of information you're releasing, open sourcing code doesn't mean including passwords or things that make the site any of the keys. But certainly we think having other eyes on it will be helpful to us.
Open source is absolutely most important thing for security because you get hackers to look at it and figure out, aha, I found the bug. And you know that companies actually do reward programmers who are ethically go back and say, you should fix that. There's faculty who do this and discover problems with routers and go to routing conferences. You better fix this. So I think this is very important. Open source, always people say, oh, it's not going to be secure because I put out my code out there. It's exactly the opposite. You get a million pairs of eyes looking at it.
Yeah, I'd also say I think it'd be great to see the public sector adopt some of the lessons from the private sector, like doing bug bounty programs to incentivize people to actually look at the code. And there's often a lot of open source code out there, so not everyone's looking too, and there's that challenge. We actually have an op-ed coming out on this, hopefully very soon. That looks at the Internet of Things and security, because the counter side of that is not just the device attack, but as we saw in this recent attack, that devices are then used create other attacks that affect infrastructure. First, I absolutely agree with what you said, Laura, that we have to keep the kind of net impact. So, Netflix goes down for 3 hours, but we've saved lives and reduced costs across the city, and maybe that's a trade-off we make. But more than that, kind of how do we address this problem commercially with Internet of Things? And the proposal that we're putting out there is that, and just like we have privacy policies on basically more things than you want, we should have security policies on this. And what that would do is it would create both more information about the types of security practices of different devices, but it would also create, and it would allow flexibility. It's not mandating specifically that you have to follow these building codes, just saying you have to say what went into the design of your building in that case. But it also allows the regulators to actually hold companies accountable for the products they're making, so that it's not just those kind of vague standards that we have right now of, did you implement reasonable security standards, which is what the FTC and others do right now, but it's, did you do what you said you were going to do? So if you said you weren't going to, if you said you were going to encrypt all your information, did you do that? If you said you weren't going to, hard code in passwords, did you do that? And so I think that's a way of kind of really advancing the state of the art while still maintaining this kind of regulatory flexibility that has served.
I think this is another example of false choice on some companies as well. You're just adding regulations. In many ways, when you add regulations, there is an incentive for companies to do it because now they don't have to worry about liability. Things go out. So I think there is a nice balance here. And if you think about lots of the technologies that really became very successful, it's because you remove the trust. So I think that's important.
One thing that I would add is one of the things that we see as a platform company that works across areas is that often what can help is organizations with more experience in the security area making those tools and capabilities available to smaller companies. And so, for example, our IoT hub, which is open source, by the way, is helping do the security updates and the communications for those sensor devices and enabling those platforms so that the groups that are specializing in the end result, so the specific area that they want to apply IoT, whether it's transportation or toasters, is, in some sense have something that they can work with. And we do the same thing with governments for CJIS compliance, so for criminal justice standards. And I think this is where standards and interoperability come in, because if you have a standard that governs how the data is exchanged, it limits the amount of people saying, well, I'll try this, which often is where you end up with unexpected security risks. I'm sorry, next question. I think there was a hand on that side of the aisle I saw. And could you state your name?
Sure. I'm Pete O'Dell. I'm the CEO of Swan Island Networks. And we're actually involved with the New York City Metropolitan Resilience Network, which is the heart of my question. So how much interaction as a chief digital officer do you have with Boston's chief resilience officers? You start thinking about driving these new initiatives forward, because they really go hand in hand. So I'm just curious from a involvement standpoint to Ezra's point, how involved that person is in the rest of your strategic planning and maybe even in your project.
Yeah, I know Tia Martin very well. She's our chief resilience officer in Boston. She's done an incredible job, I think, of breaking down some of the silos between departments. So a lot of people get trapped in sort of their mindset, but what she's done a really great job of is bringing cabinet heads and department heads to a table to talk about some of the really pressing resilience issues, in particular racial equity, and thinking about how, encouraging everyone to think about how that impacts the work that they do. And so it's easy for somebody in transportation to say, racial equity, I don't have anything to do with that, but it's been really important and interesting exercise for everybody to be thinking about how the work that they're doing is impacted by and also has an opportunity to contribute to the resilience conversation.
Lauren did mention that a couple of months ago she was at BU talking to us about the data mechanics course. And our team goes to the city of Boston talks all the time. The city of Boston was one of the partners in the scope project I mentioned, which is the designing a cloud platform for smart cities. So there is a lot of communications, obviously, multiple stakeholders there.
Oh, the first one.
Right here.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Bird, represent MAPS, the Association of Mapping and Geospatial Firms, as well as the National Society of Professional Surveyors. Probably want to compliment Elizabeth on her reference to Landsat. Big proponents and big supporters. And everyone's taking a look at innovation and where's the federal government's role. Back in 2006, the Federal Geographic Data Committee mentioned in its annual report that as much as 90% of government information has a geospatial component. So one suggestion and one question for the panel, if you're looking for a federal program where the Obama administration should receive a lot of credit for, in the business case for it, is a 3D elevation program within USGS, which is a nationwide enhanced elevation data program. 5-to-1 return on investment, 600 different public benefits to it. So the opportunity, quite frankly, when you take a look at the Internet of Things and empowering the consumer, as well as smart cities and stewardship decisions, can you elaborate a little bit more on the newer technologies, the driverless cars, and the unmanned aerial systems that not only rely on accurate geospatial data to actually operate safely, but also are the actual platforms now and into the future for collecting geospatial data?
I'll just touch quickly on you mentioned autonomous vehicles. Mayor Walsh in Boston recently signed an executive order with the state of Massachusetts to begin creating policy around what it means, because it's not sort of an if but a when these kinds of things become either sort of gobble the city or they're coming. And so the best place to be is sort of proactively thinking about how we manage those kinds of realities. And so I think I'm very bullish on the fact that there are a lot of people who I feel like are acknowledging at this point that this is a reality and that we need to build systems and policies around it. And so those have been positive. I think that we're still, obviously, we should have been doing this 5 years ago, maybe more. But it's at least promising to see where we're headed now.
Just on geospatial, so we've had 2 years ago now a legislative agenda for Congress and around data innovation. And one of the things is around geospatial data with the Earth orbit satellites. And our point was, so for those of you that aren't familiar with this very geeky concept, there's basically there's certain satellites that we use for a lot of this data that are at the end of the useful life cycle, right? And so there was going to be a gap, and basically the question is, well, what do we do about that gap? We can accelerate deploying the new satellites sooner. So is the government going to still be in the business of providing this data? But to do that, it would have to get data from the private sector, basically buy data and then make it available. And one of our points was that, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if the government makes a commitment, does provide certain type of data, and then businesses rely on it, they need to uphold that commitment. And I think that's part of this kind of thinking is, long term. I mean, we're building, data utilities, data infrastructure, right? That's going to be used. And what role, after the government makes these commitments, does it have in really upholding them, especially as it becomes a core part of, how we're doing, different things. As you mentioned, autonomous vehicles. We're going to see, I think, a lot of this where there's digital infrastructure that feeds into, the success of autonomous vehicles, and we need to make sure that once we build it, we're maintaining it, and we have kind of the right programs in place to make that, digital infrastructure sustainable, just as we think about bridges.
And I think it's important to think about the full range of organizations that are evolved from the satellites and the data, but the stuff that comes from the satellites is not useful in an autonomous vehicle. There's a lot of layers of processing, analysis, and combining with other sources. And so the data intermediary organizations make a huge difference in how you take the broad source of the data and apply it in different situations, and investing in the expertise and making sure those orgs have the right geospatial expertise. That goes back to capacity building and education, as almost all conversations do.
Thank you. Jeanette Shaw with Technology. And Azir, you had mentioned the data mechanics and plumbing, and it was raised about autonomous vehicles, and obviously that's a component of smart cities. Displacement of workers, what we hear a lot, of course, at city and state levels. A lot of companies, a lot of states, a lot of federal agencies put money into career technical education, into STEM hubs programs, as well as some union programs. Is there smart city initiatives that you see that you're working with to build that pipeline and to help the displaced workers? And then also to Daniel's point, what would those new investment models look like?
I love that question. So I sort of hinted to experiential learning, and I hinted to STEM when I, in my opening remarks about, if you think about smart cities, you can think about it for the technology, for self-driving cars, for the economy, but you can think, I cannot think of a more exciting subject that brings STEM to kids out more than smart cities. To use data about children. I mean, my son, when he was 12 years old, we started thinking about, I should have an app that will tell me when the bus is 1 block away so that I don't have to wait in the cold for it. That kind of, and they could develop these applications. They can visualize the data. So I think in terms of using the smart city as a platform for education, I think it's limitless, let's put it this way. Also including for the workforce development. I think we talk a lot about data science and big data, etc. There's a lot of data here that could be used to advance some of these skills.
I think it's a really difficult. I was just say it's a really difficult problem. I was actually just reading an article this morning about a lot of people think of autonomous vehicles and they think of cities, but this was actually for truck drivers, and talking about the millions of people employed by the truck driving industry and the kind of impact it's going to have on cities across the nation when that becomes autonomous. And thinking about, not just that, but I mean, I think, what is it, something like 1.3 million people are killed every year by cars. And if that goes away, we have a whole new population to train and a workforce to develop. And so there are a lot of things at play here. But I think that there are, for too many people, it's still a really scary thing, thinking about how you translate what you do now. I think it's you see it all over the country. It's really scary for cab drivers to think about what happens if that's not a viable business for them anymore. And so I think the really hard thing is figuring out how they go from being scared that the job that they currently do won't exist anymore and get excited about the kinds of opportunities that will be presented by these new technologies. But I think it's part of the problem. I don't know that anybody has sort of cracked that yet, but it's one of those inescapable things that's quickly headed, or currently is a reality in all cities.
I just had, when we had this conversation, I think we often talk about all the new opportunities for digital type jobs. There's also, I think one of the big messages with things and data analytics is that it's not just, a city or a state or a nation wants to be a provider of these services. It wants to use these services in the economies and industries it already has, right? And so a lot of this is about making, particular industries more competitive. And, that's going to be, in even traditional jobs, right? So it's really about how you can have a thriving economy and how you can be more competitive globally, not just about, displacement in certain, yes, we're going to have fewer truckers in the future, but that's okay if, our local, agriculture industry takes off in this, this new artisanal, cheese that we're creating, or whatever it is.
Yeah, I'm from a small town in North Idaho, and we had there was like one large employer. I don't know if anybody knows of Coldwater Creek, but that was a big employer in this town. That was where it started. And after they went away, a lot of people thought the town would shrink because all the workers would leave. But instead, what happened was the downtown had this huge revitalization where all these brew pubs started cropping up, and all these people who had these sort of niche things that they used to do at home turned them into businesses. And I think that it's not inconceivable that craftsmanship and there are a lot of other industries that we may see crop up as a result of these other ones going away.
And I would add a smaller, more practical comment, which is we definitely talk about education and training in the formal education and training system, but, and this goes back to some of the conversation we had about open data and how governments and how they conduct their existing programs and responsibilities are evolving. And so the question also comes into sort of inline on the job training, how do we help existing jobs, whether it's in healthcare, government, transportation, et cetera, figure out how the new smart cities technologies are going to change how they do their current jobs and give them the skills to continue to do the jobs that they have well. I think we have time for one more question. Do we have one more question? Yes, right here in the front. Boy, you can tell that my glasses are really thick. The people in the front catch my attention first. I apologize. It's just physics.
I had a question about the challenges and solutions of IT infrastructure and the needs that cities will have. Like Honolulu and Hilo aren't particularly known for like great IT infrastructure. And then sort of related to that, the challenges and solutions for broadband needs that the cities of the future will need. Thank you.
I mean, I think increasingly broadband is seen as more of a utility, which is I think a really promising direction. Because it is going to, people don't need phone lines going to their homes anymore. What they need is internet access, and that should be thought of as a basic right like water. And so seeing more and more places going in that direction, I think is really important. We recently partnered with Verizon to implement broadband throughout Boston. So Fios is coming to Boston in neighborhood by neighborhood. And that has been sort of extremely important for us. But I think one of the hard things, and I think as Jerry mentioned earlier, it's not just about implementing new technology, it's about supporting it. I think the hard part is right now government is not really structured to support constantly changing technology. So the HR systems, the procurement systems, legal systems are all oriented around hiring Oracle to do everything. And that's not the world we operate in anymore. And so in small ways, what we're trying to do is encourage people to do sort of tours of duty in government, because it's not feasible for you to come and join the city and know one programming language and stay there your whole life and then collect a pension. Like, you have to adapt, and so it's changing the kinds of people we hire. So governments typically hire project managers, and I had to teach our HR team what a product manager was, which is insane for anyone from the private sector. That's a very common job. But this idea that you have people in place who are constantly evolving technology and working with it, investing in it, is sort of a cultural change that's going on now, but I think it still has a long way to go.
I mean, I think maybe I add one comment on the IT. We're moving to the cloud. There's all these cloud services. So there are other models for supporting this transition. And I think this is where we should think. I think cities should start thinking about maybe procuring services as opposed to just buying some software or buying a solution. So I think that's quite important. Going back to the notion of people and support. In the open source community, there's wonderful applications out there that nobody's paying for. They're developed because there is enough programmers excited about it that they keep it alive. A lot of the tools I use, they're developed and maintained for years by volunteers from all over the world. You mentioned earlier the new way to develop software. The tree is collaborative, etc. So if there are services that the city creates and that citizens and individuals are interested in, it will be supported and hosted on the cloud. So I think there are really different ways to think, and I think this is the transition that we have to make.
I'll just add, whenever I'm thinking about cities faced with these infrastructure questions and what they're going to do, I like to think of Paris and, back in the days when they were trying to decide what they were going to do about their sewer system, right? For the longest time, they said, we're not going to build it, it's too hard, there's too many people here. And, eventually, just people were dying in the streets, right? Because it was a serious health hazard. And they said, we have to do this. And then they built a sewer system that, it's just, this magnificent kind of infrastructure that, yes, it's still being improved and revised, but it allowed the city to grow into what it is today, right? And so I think, a lot of cities are going to, they see the Internet of Things, they see the challenges they have, and they say, wow, this is this really big problem. Can we take it on? And I think a lot of them are scared to take it on. But I think they should have the optimism that no, if you confront these challenges, it is really hard, but you can come up with something that really changes what you adopt in the future. So I think that's kind of the lesson I think a lot of leadership.
I am not.
Can I have some
No, so I'm sorry, we just have to,
No
to be.
question. No question. I have addition. See, basically, I'm working in a smart city since 2012. I am from India, and I just came for US State Department research. So, for me, a smart city means, sustainable, maintainable, affordable, resilient town. And IT is a catalyst. Because European, if you think European smart city, US, India, already mentioned, we have 100 smart city plan. But we always focus on technology part. Like, we must use technology as a catalyst. You remember 2000, what happened in e-governance? We put a lot of IT. And trust me, many projects fail. Like, government process reengineering. So I coined the term, city process reengineering. You have to understand the process, every process of city to make it sustainable, maintainable, affordable for the people. Because ultimately, city for what? City for citizen. So this is my addition. And Professor, as you mentioned, the open community. One of the big examples, Fiverr, European Commission. They have a private academy and public partnership. And a lot of people putting their innovation apps through open source, Fiverr. So this is addition.
I want to I really appreciate everybody's time this afternoon, and I want, before you go, for everybody to join me in thanking the panelists for their and thank you all, and to ITIF for hosting us. Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you. I'm sorry, about New York and resilience.